What is going on, gamers? It is me, Dan, moderately anonymous MTG, and we're back today with some really fun stuff. I am really excited to do this with y'all. So last year, I was doing an experiment where I recorded every cEDH game that I played, and there is an asterisk on this because I did stop playing stream games around October, and I took a little break from streaming in October through the end of the year. But we've got the data from everything from January to September from last year in 2023, and we're going to take a look at it today. Take a look at some of my decks, take a look at my overall win rates, take a look at what decks are working, what decks weren't working, take a look at what was working in them, and just pour over all this data and see what cEDH was like for me in 2023. Of course, before we hop into the episode today, just want to remind y'all, please like and subscribe. It helps boost us up in the algorithm. It helps get the show in front of more eyes and more people. So it's big helpful if y'all like, subscribe, comment. Also, if you want to help support the show, go hit up our Patreon, get access to our private Discord, a bunch of bonus content here on YouTube, as well as other awesome benefits. And make sure you use our Dragon Shield and TCG player affiliate links if you want to pick up any of the cool cards that we're talking about today, or if you want to sleeve them up in some awesome Dragon Shield sleeves, or put them on your awesome Dragon Shield playmats. All right, so this is the copy of our spreadsheet that we've got for 2023. This is categorizing all of my games across all of my decks. As you can see on the left side here in this yellow box, we've got all of the different decks and their individual win rates. We've got reps on Najeela, Tymna Jeska, Quark and Sakashima, Tivit, Sisay, Weatherlight Captain, the 5-color Sisay, Kess, Dissonant Mage, and Tymna Jeska. And then up here in the top left corner, we have got the overall win rates. The overall games are 90, overall wins. We've got a straight 50% win rate last year. Pretty good, not too shabby, right? Yeah, I mean, granted, we did stop 2 months early, so there's a lot more data that we could have collected that would have fluctuated that, but can't hate stopping at an even 50%. And then we basically, these are just the catalogs of all of our games. We've got the date the game happened on. This game column basically is just a way to count the individual games. That's if you click on any of these cells here, you're going to see the formulas that I used to fill them out and keep them filled out automatically after we fill in our games. So if this is something that you're interested in, keeping up a copy of your games for the next year, I'll have the spreadsheet linked in the description of the video. So we've got our game counter column, we've got our win or loss column. These are either just ones or zeros that are going to calculate whether we got 1 win or 0 wins. The next is our winning turn or our losing turn columns. We have got our commanders to keep everything separated. The number of cards in our opening hand. Now, as someone who harps heavily on mulligans, this is going to be an interesting thing to go over. And then we've got table position, small notes for the game, and then we've got a column for the best card in the deck, which you can see is not filled out for every single game, nor are the notes either. I tried to be a little bit more meticulous about the notes, but best card column is something that I liked and something that I enjoyed reflecting on. I think I'm going to add a worst card column as well for my next year of recording. So you might be asking yourself, what is the point of doing all of this? And basically the point is to keep track of your games, what's going on in them, what's good about them, what's bad about them. And the idea is that you're not only going to be able to shape the 98 or the 99 of your deck by seeing what works and what doesn't work, but you're also going to be able to shape your mentality of the games that you're playing by showing you what gameplay patterns work and what gameplay patterns don't work. And that's really where the note section comes into play. But it's also just a great way to track your overall deck status, track which decks are working the best for you and which decks are really just not performing well enough for you. But let's go ahead and take a closer look into all of these individual stats, what they mean, and what we can extrapolate from them. So to go over our general stats again, we have got 90 games logged, we've got 45 win logs, a 50% win rate. Our average opening hand size is 6.07, which is very interesting. Again, like I said, I'm a person who is generally not afraid to go to 4 or 5, but I am averaging just almost a straight 6 every time, which is very interesting. I think it has a large portion to do with the decks that I've been maining over the last year. We've got Najeela with 26 games in total clocked here, and Tivit with 27 games clocked here. We look at these in comparison to the more turbo-oriented decks that are Kess and Tymna Jeska, which both respectively have 15 games logged on them. We just have way more games where we're playing mid-range games in 2023. So I think that is largely where our 6 average hand size comes from. Playing these control decks and playing a deck like Najeela that just generally has a really high card quality, it's just generally going to lead to more hands where we get to keep closer to 7, which is pretty sweet. I love to see that. I don't necessarily want to see that my average hand size is like 4 or something because I'm not afraid of aggressively mulliganing. We definitely rather keep more cards than fewer, but yeah, just interesting to see. If I had to guess at the beginning of this year, I would have guessed it would have been closer to 5, but I think I was playing a little bit more Kess at the beginning of the year. As we go through the individual dates, we'll see when Tivit actually hits the shelves and when I start playing him, because that's where we're going to see a huge amount of Tivits on the board. And yeah, I think that's probably where that comes from. So next we have our average winning turn, which is just a shade over 5 at 5.02. Our average losing turn is 5.32, which if you you were ever a fan of the cEDH metagame project, which used to be run by MTG Squirrel Nest, it was a really awesome project where people could log their games from anywhere in the world on this cEDH data server, and Squirrel Mob would at the end of every month go through them, extrapolate data from them, and talk about basically the state of the meta each and every month. And over again, we saw that the average turn of a cEDH game is about 5 turns, so this is right on track with what we would expect, especially given that, like I said, we have been playing more decks like Najeela and Tivit rather than the more fast-oriented Kess or Tymna decks. But we do have individual stats for all of these decks as well, which we're also going to pour into, so we'll take a look at that in a minute. Last up in this just general stats column is our standard deviation on wins and losses in this game. We have an average winning turn of 5.02, so the standard deviation is 1.64, and that means 1.64 turns on either side of 5.02 is our standard deviation of basically the average window of where we might win, somewhere between turns 3.5 to turn 6.5. Our standard deviation on our losses is a little bit bigger, which is interesting. We have our average losing turn on 5.32, and the standard deviation on those losses is 2.22 turns there. Quickly before we move on from the general stats, just to go over our individual win rates with individual decks. Najeela, we've got 7 wins out of 26 games with a 27% win rate. Tymna, we have got 2 wins out of 4 plays and a straight 50% there. Kark and Sakashima, 1 of 1 maybe, 100% win rate, can't beat it. Tivit, we've got 16 wins out of 27 games, leaving us just a hair below our 60% win rate, which is pretty impressive with a new deck, and 2, just any deck in general. Like, it's a pretty high win rate for cEDH, so I'm pretty impressed with that. Sisay, again, 1 of 1. This was a patron deck that we did over the year. If you want to check out the Sisay Weatherlight Captain, really awesome gameplay episode on the channel. I'll link it in the card above. Super fun one for sure. Definitely go check that out. Kess, we have 10 wins on 15 games, a 66.6% win rate on that. Honestly, this one was very surprising to me. Kess is not regarded as a really great deck in the meta. I think anyone can tell you that. I'm a pretty good Kess pilot as far as they go. I've been playing the deck as long as I've been playing cEDH, which is, we're just going on about 5 years now, so a pretty long time. Kess still got it. It's still a really great mid-range Grixis deck. I love that deck, and I think it performs really well. And it's something I'm going to continue to play into 2024 because of these stats, honestly. I was just really impressed with that. And Tymna Jeska, 9 wins out of 15 games, 60% win rate. Not too shabby. I think actually these numbers are skewed because I went through these individual games and logged the individual wins and losses and stats and everything like that down below. I think maybe we actually have 8 wins on Jeska rather than the 9. I think I miscounted in this slot here, so we'll check on that in a minute. So as we go over just the general stats of the year here, again, all of this data is really fun and interesting to track and note for yourself, but I think by far the most valuable data that we have here is our notes and best card columns. Looking at the notes, I try to keep them pretty simple, kind of shorthand, just short descriptions of either the game or what went really right or what went really wrong in the game. For our first game on Najeela of the year, we have the notes, if Chance for Glory was Druid's Repository, could have won the game sooner. 1, because Phil, that is our friend Fraben Yu, didn't respect my position at the table more than our other friend Scoopface. This was a stream game. I very vividly remember this, and one actually reason that I do vividly remember this game is because of these notes, which is another really prime example of why you should be keeping notes of games. You're going to be able to keep specific games in your memory, and I do remember that I had a fairly good Najeela board, and Scoop was on, I want to say Winota, and also had a pretty sweet board, but had just a little bit of a higher advantage. I had a win con in my hand, though, that Phil did not know about, and that was the key difference between winning and losing that game, was just being able to hold on to that information a little bit longer. This is another note on Najeela here, one that I very vividly remembered. Need to respect Malcolm tutors for creatures. One of my unofficial co-hosts of the show, Scoots, was on a big Malcolm and Vile Smasher tear last year, so I had to really be wary of him pivoting between Grixis win cons and Glenhorn Buccaneer win cons, which would get me every single time. I kept falling into the usual thinking of, I don't need to counter this Vampiric Tutor because I'll counter whatever ad nauseum type effect that Scoots gets off of the Vampiric Tutor, but obviously you can't Flusterstorm Glenhorn Buccaneer, so that was something that really stuck in my memory there and something that I have not forgotten about since. This is pretty much the first month that we're looking at right here that's entirely on screen, and one thing that you're going to notice is that my win rate is absolutely abysmal. We played 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19 games in the first month of 2023, and only won 5 of them, which is like hurts a lot. I remember going through this period and really not wanting to continue keeping the stats because it felt bad. But obviously, like, getting to the 50% win rate overall at the end of the year, like, that's the prize that you're really going for. And seeing these sort of small sample sizes and how they can affect your mentality of how you're going into your games was really eye-opening for me, honestly, because I remember going through this month and having a real stinker of a month on all my games. And honestly, I was having a little bit less fun playing. But as we start to move through to the second month, this is when Tivit comes out. See, we get the introduction of Tivit right around, I guess the 11th of February last year was my first game on Tivit. Won my first game on it, which is awesome. Always love to win your first game. It looks like 6 games straight after that. No, actually many more. 9 games straight on Tivit, and won 6 of them. So, or 5 of them rather. So yeah. That's the sort of thing that really helps turn you around, is when you start to get into these streaks here, where all of these green marks on here, this is just an easy visual identifier. These are all of our wins, and the black marks are the losses in our data here. Now, especially here when we're messing with a new deck, this is where these notes really come in handy. Again, this is a deck that I've never played before, and you can see for these first few games that I didn't keep any notes for them, and it can be kind of difficult because basically a lot of my cEDH playing happens on stream live on Twitch, so I'm either filling these out between rounds while I'm live on Twitch and hosting the show, or I'm going back after the game is over and like reviewing the footage and then putting the data in afterwards. So there are some times where I'm just doing it for really basic information like the opening hand size and everything like that, and I didn't take as much time to do the notes. But as you can see, we move into here and we have way more notes, which are super helpful. We have the beginnings of marking what our good cards in Tivit are: Smothering Tithe, Displacer Kit, and Grand Abolisher. And these were all super pivotal things because they help you to focus on what you need to get the game going. It's not that you necessarily want to mulligan until you get to Smothering Tithe or Displacer Kitten, but you can kind of know that those are 1, good tutor targets, and 2, good things to see in your opening hand if you have a coherent game plan that gets to them in a timely manner. Moving through February into March, we see the deck start to vary up a little bit more. I'm playing a little bit of Kess. This is our cEDH game here last March the 8th. And also starting to play some more Najeela in here. We got a Tymna game. But again, the more that we look at these green blocks, the more that we see the name Tivit pop up over and over again. 3 losses there on Tivit, but picking up some more wins here. And then as we move on later into the year, and we start to just see a lot more wins going up on the board. We definitely start to hit a stride here. But yeah, just a few individual losses, and this is working towards the end of the year. So this is the end of October here when we stopped streaming. And yeah, you can see a solid pattern over the year of just picking up and getting more wins than we did losses. These notes started helping a lot more. I was reading these pretty incessantly over the year, going over these maybe once a week to just check up and see what I was thinking about last week and thinking about my decks and things like that. And honestly, I think the biggest thing for me was just writing these notes down and making them stick in my memory that way. I'm the kind of person where if I hear something once, it is not going to stick in my memory absolutely. If I write something down, I'm going to remember it a lot more specifically. Now moving on, we've got the individual decks. There are a number of decks that we have up here that just have a small enough sample size. Tymna, Kraken, Sakashima, cEDH. These decks I did not include because the data is just not that valuable with the sample size that small. But Najeela, we've got 26 games on here, lots of good data that we can extrapolate from that. So let's look at the individual stats here on Najeela. Like I said before, we got 7 wins out of 26 games at a 27% win rate, or just a shade under. Average winning turn on this one a little bit faster than our average overall at 4.5, and average losing turn almost strictly a turn after that at 5.67. Standard deviation on our wins is 2.3, which is pretty huge. It means that we were getting some like pretty early wins here, but also not losing momentum in the mid to long game, which I think is very indicative of the Najeela spirit. It's just a deck that goes fast really well, or pivots into long-term game plans and combo game plans really well. Standard deviation on the losses on this one is 1.98, which is also pretty wide, to be honest. And I think there's probably a number of factors that can feed into this. Average opening hand size for this one is 6.33, which is super sweet. I think that means that the deck is built pretty consistently and pretty well, since the game plan of Najeela is to just get Najeela or like a Ristic Study effect out on turn 1 and then just ride that to victory. We've got the consistency behind us on this one, so I love to see that. That's exactly what we want to see here. Other data that we've broken down, I've gotten a list of all of the notable cards that we noted for Najeela, and only a couple of them came up more than once. Mystic Remora came up more than once, and Ad Nauseam came up more than once. And I've just basically split them up into very general categories. I could go a lot deeper than this, and I think that like mana production is probably another thing I would like to track in here, but it just wasn't a subject that really came up a whole lot, which is interesting. But we've got our 3 basic categories, which are card draw, aggressive cards, or defensive cards. Card draw I'm counting as card advantage, like Ad Nauseam, Mystic Remora, Toski, and Sama. Those are all card draw cards that I put in there. Aggressive cards are things that I think are just lending themselves to an aggressive strategy, i.e. attacking mostly. Things like Professional Facebreaker or Ragavan, and then of course defense is like very literally like defensive cards, interactive cards, things like our March of Swirling Mist, things like Opposition Agent. And then we've just got our wins and losses split up by our seat positions. So in seat 1, we've got 2 wins and 3 losses, which is interesting because Najeela tends to take advantage of the first position really well. Being able to attack before other people have put up defenses is one of the strong suits of the deck. But if you're not on the attacking game plan in your opening hands, that will obviously affect how the game goes. But yeah, interesting to see more seat 1 losses than wins there. Seat 2, similar story, one win and 4 losses in seat 2. Oh, I'm just noticing now as I'm going over this, I have miscounted once again on our Najeela Games. This is one of the things that I have to put in manually because it's difficult to set up a formula for Excel to catch the word Najeela and then count it as like a number in here. So we actually only have 6 wins out of 26 here. That puts us to a 23% win rate on this deck, which doesn't feel great. But it is what it is. Still around 25%, which is around average. I would have liked to have done a little bit better on Najeela as far as an entire year's worth of games goes. But yeah, to continue on with our seat position wins, we have got 1 win in the seat 2 position and 4 losses in seat 2. Seat 3, we've got 2 wins and 6 losses, and in seat 4, 1 win and 4 losses. So picking up the most wins in seat 1 and 3, which is interesting. But like we said, this is a deck that pivots well. It's not always on the aggressive game plan. It doesn't always need to be attacking with Najeela. We see our least amount of losses come from the seat 1 position, which does make a lot of sense because like we said, Najeela really utilizes that advantage of seat 1 really well. And not very surprising to see that the most amount of losses come in seat 3 and 4 here. With cards like Ragamon and Lotha running around the meta now, there are honestly a lot fewer places to getting your Najeela attackers early on. So the earlier on the board, the better. That's why I always try to advise getting Najeela on the board as early as turn 1. You're trying to outrace those things. If you get even one opponent who is off of a 2x in the first position, you're going to have a lot better time than not. Looking at the notable card section, I think that it's pretty telling of this is where our commander basically has a hole in the strategy, is card draw. So our commander is really great at putting together aggressive strategies that help to take over the game. It is not good at keeping its hand filled, and that's why I'm up on Toski, which I think a lot of the decks are simply on Samut as their draw engine in the deck. But honestly, I've never been sad to see Toski either. And furthermore, seeing card draw come up 5 times, like by far the most helpful category of our notable cards, I'm pretty keen to keep Toski in there. And these are the kind of results that we're looking for when we're looking at these notes is what is coming up the most often. Are we playing to that? Do we need to adjust our deck to play towards those sorts of things? Or do we want to continue to lean into those sorts of things? And yeah, for me, I'm going to continue to lean in on slots like Toski as being really pivotal in helping this deck get along. Next up, we have our Tivit Games. And again, I went through the numbers here to make sure that everything was right. And I found that I had miscounted once more. We actually have 17 wins on Tivit out of 27 games, putting us above the 60% win rate up to 62.96. So nice. Good on us there. We got our extra points somewhere. So with our 63% average win rate, we have an average winning turn of 5.06, average losing turn of 6.0, which is nice. Nice even number there. Standard deviation on the wins is 1.29. Standard deviation on the losses is 2.19, which again, for control deck, I think makes sense. The duty of the control deck is to keep the table in check. If things get out of our control, that's when we start to see either decks win really early because we're not able to get the hooks in early enough, or the hooks are dislodged and we have our board removed or something like that. We have our hate pieces removed, Tivit gets removed, something like that, and we go into a little bit of a later game and lose somewhere in there. That makes sense to me. Average opening hand size of 6.27. Love to see that. Again, a good consistent deck that's going to get us what we need to do really quickly. And again, this is a deck that doesn't ask for a lot from its opening hands, and I think that's again another reason why it is a lot higher than we might see for some other decks. And that is because basically this deck doesn't need card draw, it doesn't need counter spells, it just needs mana. It needs to put 6 mana on the board and get Tivit down, and then that will in a lot of cases take over the game by itself. You've seen how many times someone playing a turn 1 Sarah Ascendant will take over a game just by having a 6/6 speeder. Well, having a 6/6 speeder that makes mana and draws cards is obviously that much better. Looking at our wins and losses, we have got in seat 1 4 wins and 1 loss. Love to see that. Again, Tivit is another deck that really takes advantage of that first seat position, being able to get down really effective hate pieces in front of other people, or just being able to cast your really game-altering spells before other people can properly interact with them. It's a really, really big win for this deck. In seat 2, we've got 4 wins and 2 losses. Seat 3, we've got 8 wins and 4 losses. And in seat 4, we have got 1 win and 2 losses, the only place where we do have more losses than wins. And a huge part of that, I'm going to guess, is due to Dockside Extortionist. Now, just by a single game, we do actually have 1 more win in the later seats than we do in the earlier seats. Again, this isn't the fastest deck, and it does really lose a lot of momentum to Dockside Extortionist. Not only lose a lot of momentum, it loses a lot of games to Dockside Extortionist. And I think that's probably represented by us being a little bit later in the turn position. We tap out for a Tivit, put all those treasures and clues on board, and then person goes in the first position, casts their Dockside Extortionist, wins the game because we don't have interaction. Looking into the notable deck slots, we have got Smothering Tithe coming up twice, Then we've got Kitten, Abolisher, Path to Exile, Mystic Remora, Deluge, and Tivit in and of itself coming up as one of the most notable cards. And I think, honestly, if I was going to be consistent in that, I think Tivit probably would have come up many more times, because Tivit is usually the thing that turns the games around and really is a huge sticking point for what the dictation of the rest of the game looks like. Breaking it down into our different categories, we got 1 in the card draw category, and that's our Mystic Remora, 4 in the aggressive category, and that would be our 2 Smothering Tithe mentions, our Displacer Kitten mention, and our Tivit mention. Now, this is one of those areas that's much more gray on what it actually means to be aggressive, with Smothering Tithe making up half of this category, and this is where it really made me start to want to think about including mana production as a category in this. But for the sake of the argument of keeping things simple, I just threw it in the aggressive category. Making mana is sort of aggressive. We want to aggressively get out the Smothering Tithe as part of that too. If it doesn't come out on turn 1 or 2, it's not really a super useful spell unless we're planning on things going into the long game. So if we did have that extra category for mana production, it would be an even split on aggressive slots in 3 and defensive slots in 3. And the defensive slots are the Toxic Deluge, Path to Exile, and Grand Abolisher. Grand Abolisher is a forever staple of how good this deck is, because it's an easy thing to get down. It's sort of innocuous, and also it eats up interaction that might otherwise be used on Tivit, and having those distraction points that are cheap for me to cast and very costly for opponents to let stay around on the board are pretty awesome, because I need those distraction points really badly, because our combo can be kind of fragile, but it's protection like Grand Abolisher and Teferi Time Raveler that really help keep the deck putting up the W's consistently. Next up, we have got our sort of smaller categories with our aggressive decks. First, we're checking out Kess. I was mistaken earlier. I think I said that Tymna Jeska was the one that I might have miscounted the wins on, but it's actually Kess. We've got 8 wins out of 15 games for a 53.3 repeating % win rate. Our average winning turn, this is an aggro deck, so it tends to win a little bit earlier. We're looking at 4.25 as our average winning turn, which makes sense. Our average losing turn is 4.20, which is really interesting, because if I were to guess in a vacuum, I would guess that Kess tends to lose out to decks that are a little bit better on staying on the board longer than them, but it's actually kind of proving that the deck loses to decks that are just more aggressive than it, which I think makes sense, because Kess doesn't play a lot of super defensive strategies in the deck. It plays a good amount of interaction. I want to say I maybe have 12 counter spells in the deck, which tends to be a little bit higher than the average deck. I tend to be a little bit higher on my defensive interaction in most decks. But again, the role of Kess is not to play police at the table. Having things like Toxic Deluge that you can cast once or twice using Kess's ability are things that make the deck really clutch and actually make the deck really good at going to the mid to long game. But it's not trying to play police. It's not really trying to stop decks that are a lot faster than it. It's really trying to stop decks that are trying to stop it. Standard deviation on our wins is 1.16, and standard deviation on our losses is 2.28, a little bit wider. Again, we're losing to much more aggressive decks, or decks that are a little bit better in the mid-range than us. Average opening hand size, again, here we're seeing something that I think is a little bit more indicative of the kind of deck that we're looking at. Average opening hand size of just below 5.5 at 5.43. So I think one of the problems of Kess is that as a deck that asks for more out of its mulligans than, say, a deck like Rogue Silas does. Rogue Silas is mostly looking for mana that it can transform into one payoff spell. Kess kind of rides the line of wanting to find mana, wanting to find ways to build up its board, wanting to find a mid-range engine like Rhystic Study. It's a deck that's a little bit, I don't want to say less focused, but it is a little bit less pinpointed, let's say, than something like Rogue Silas in comparison, that is all really refining to the one tip of trying to cast Ad Nauseam and Wheel of Fortune as quickly as possible, which used to be the point of Kess in very much of my philosophy of building and playing the deck. But as time goes on, as the meta changes, I'm starting to play a little bit more on the back end, a little bit more of the mid-range strategy with this deck. While there are many powerful aspects about the deck, this is definitely one of the drawbacks, is that the mulligans does ask more out of what is specifically in your hand. Looking at our notable cards here, we've got Burgi, we've got Mnemonic Betrayal, Underworld Breach, 2 mentions for Defense Grid, Yawgmoth's Will, and Mystic Remora. And for our categories, we got that split up into 4 card draw mentions, 1 aggro, which is the Burgi, which is, again, kind of the line there between mana production and aggressive strategies. I think there's also an argument there for labeling that as some sort of card advantage, and being that you make mana out of it without having to spend cards. And then we've got 2 mentions for defense in Defense Grid, which is a super primo card. I can't believe it was a card that I hadn't always played, because it's so good. Wins and losses on seat positions, we got no seat 1 data for Kess, unfortunately, in 2023. So no wins, no losses. In seat 2, we've got 2 wins and 3 losses. Seat 3, we've got 2 wins and 2 losses, and in seat 4, we've got 4 wins and 1 loss. Which, again, before we talked about how this deck can sort of lay in the cut a little bit, can sort of let the faster decks go first, let them be the first ones to stumble and catch some counter spells, and then pick up the pieces and use Kess's ability or some of our other more powerful effects like Mnemonic Betrayal and Underworld Breach to just out-advantage the table. And also, this is something that I joke about frequently, but is also very true. When you're in 4th position, your dock side is usually the best dock side. Your opponents go through their turns, they tap out, they play all of their mana vaults, you go up, you play your Dockside Extortionist, and you get the full benefit of everyone that's gone before you. And if you look at the notes on all of our turn 4 games, it actually tells a pretty perfect story of us just letting other players be the more aggressive deck and then us picking up the pieces. Our first win in seat 4 here, saddled up in 4th, let other players spend their interaction, cast Bergian to mean bet without interaction and won. Easy peasy, just like we drew it up. The next one we got here, politic the shit out of the game, cast a defensive ad nauseum to not die, and had to really navigate Tony's win attempt to get through it. Defense grid brought it home. Big ups for defense grid, we love to see it. The next one we got, kept on a Ristic Study and a Notion Thief, played Control and snuck in a Final Fortune over an opponent's draw 7, could have cast Kess and made it tight, but pulled Yogg's Will instead and won the game. And the last turn 4 win of the year, coming in June, turn 1 Remora into Mana Crypt, drew Ristic Study, benefited from opponent's board wipe, drew into Demonic, and won with Intuition line. So you can see we are just sort of laying in the cut in all these positions, letting our opponents make a little bit more aggressive plays than us, maybe letting someone else board wipe and really take care of some problems for us, and then us just picking up the pieces, being the more aggressive deck, being the deck that just basically sculpted their hand the best over time. And finally, we've got our Tymna Jeska games. On Tymna Jeska, we've got 9 wins out of 15 games for a strict 60% win rate with that. Our average winning turn is 5.56, average losing turn is 4.0, standard deviation on the wins 1.81, standard deviation on the losses 1.0, average opening hand size of 5.93, which is surprising to me. I would have expected that this deck tends to go a little bit lower on average, because this is one of the decks that I think has really trained me to not be afraid of mulliganing. But again, fairly consistent deck. We're looking for pretty simple things. We're looking to just cast Tymna and maybe some attackers early, or we're looking to make an aggressive win attempt early. Now we got an average winning turn of 5.56, which is a little bit later, and what I sort of suspected from this stat is that we were going to see that we didn't win on our first win attempt as much as we won on our second win attempt. Mardu is a color pie that is really great at putting up strong win attempts and doing it consistently, not super great at protecting them. But what I found actually through looking through these notes, looking at our wins that have the latest turns here, like 7 and 8, the story that we have in our notes is basically that we just played the game patiently, drew cards with Tymna, and then eventually put together a Grand Abolisher win attempt. And I think this makes a lot of sense when we look at our average losing turn at being 4 and the standard deviation on that loss being 1. So sometimes losing on an average as early as turn 3. This is a deck that used to be considered a turbo ad nauseum deck, and it still has all of those pieces in it. It's still running Rain of Filth, Culling the Weak, and things like that, but it is more value oriented now than I think it ever has been in the past. And that's because of the fact that creatures are a little bit more powerful than they were a few years ago when this deck was a little bit more popular. But it's also a deck that's really interactive, so it's pretty good at keeping itself alive while it does wait to set up these advantage engines and then put together win attempts that our opponents can't compete with. Looking at our wins by seat position, we've got in seat 1, we've got 6 wins and 0 losses. Love to see that. Very telling at how good this deck is at being aggressive, and also how good it is at taking advantage of opponents who have not gotten the chance to set up their defenses yet. This is a deck that I really like to play with that sort of shark mentality of, if I smell blood in the water, if I smell the fact that my opponents probably aren't going to have enough interaction to try to beat me on this turn, I'm going to start making win attempts as early as possible. Seat 2, absolutely no data for seat 2. No wins, no losses on this one. For seat 3, we've got an even split of 3 wins and 3 losses. And then in 4th seat, again, this is just the antithesis of decks that want to attack with creatures and play aggressively and greedily. 4th position, yeah, just 3 losses there. Not a super big surprise. If we look at some of the notes of our seat 4 losses, like this one here, kept a very mediocre hand, blue player tapped out with interaction in hand, lost to Corval Dockside. This is kind of the story that's just going to come up a lot. This is a deck that kind of needs to tap out for advantage pieces in the early turns, doesn't necessarily get to play a lot of cheap interaction or a lot of really widespread interaction. So it's kind of a deck that is parasitic in the fact that it will really rely on our opponents to keep other decks in check. If we do see other strategies that are a lot more aggressive than us, like Corval decks, like Rog Silas decks, those are the decks to watch out for, and those are the decks to really keep your opponents keen on. It's sort of a joke that I will very often say on the channel that I'm in Mardu and I don't have interaction, but Mardu does actually have a fair amount of ways to help interact with the table. It's just not always necessarily early, and it's not always necessarily the kind of cards that interact well with other really aggressive strategies. What can we really do to stop an opponent's Dockside in our deck? Not much. I can exile your Underworld Breach with a March of Otherworldly Light, but getting to that point, you probably already won the game, and those are the sorts of pivot points where we really need our blue opponents to sort of get the bottleneck down our opponent. We can sort of be the last line of defense in a lot of situations, but we're not really good at being the first line of defense. Looking at our notable cards, we've got Grim Hireling is one of the first mentions, which is funny because I forgot that I actually used to run that in this deck, but did win us a game in 2023. It was a cool game. I don't know that it is on the channel, but I do remember it quite well because of reading through my notes and remembering I twin flamed a Grim Hireling and made like exactly enough treasures to get through my Bomberman combo. With multiple mentions, we've got the One Ring, Grand Abolisher, and Ad Nauseum, and then we've just got a slew of other things. So broken down in our categories, we got 4 card draw, which makes sense because Tymna is sort of our main card advantage engine in the deck. And again, one of those reasons why we tend to tap out in the first couple of turns to try to get Tymna down and attackers. We've got 6 mentions for our cards that are either pushing forward our aggressive game plan or are literally attacking for Tymna, and then we've got 9 mentions for defensive spells, which again makes a ton of sense because our defensive spells are going to always be our most valuable. Like I said, our deck is really good at putting up win attempts, not good at protecting them. So when we do find our defense grid, our Grand Abolisher, those are some of the most pivotal pieces that we can have to really feeling safe putting together a win attempt in this deck. So honestly, right in line with what I would have thought. It honestly makes me think a little bit harder about including the One Ring in this list since it doesn't come up a whole lot. It is one of our multiple time mentions, but it might be one of those situations where a slightly more aggressive card like Necropotence could be a little bit better for this deck than the One Ring is. So there it is. There's our basic stats and our basic overview of these all these games for 2023. This was an awesome experiment. It was something that I honestly had a ton of fun doing. It feels really satisfying to log those W's. Feels less satisfying to log the losses, but I definitely learned a lot from this list. It's taken a lot of assumptions that I have of why certain things are working or why they're not working and made me change my perception on them by actually reading the notes, reading what actually happened, going through games a little bit more closely in my mind. So it's something that I found super helpful for my games actually in this past year and something that I think has honestly improved my skills as a player. So definitely something I highly advise that you would do too. If you want to check out my spreadsheet here, copy it and put in your own data, make sure you go check out our video description. There will be a link to this specific spreadsheet there. Again, you can click on all these numbers and see all of the different formulas that I've put here that'll keep it automatically updated for you. All right, so now that we've looked over everything, let's take a look at some final year-end stats for the best and worst of the year. So obviously our best commander overall is Tivit. Tivit coming in super hot with a 62% win rate. That is absolutely incredible. So if I'm looking at this data over the year and I'm trying to decide what deck I'm going to be taking to a tournament next year, it's absolutely going to be Tivit. I'm very clearly the most comfortable with it, very clearly know that deck the best and can navigate the most wins with it the most consistently. Love to see some very strong results for a deck that I have been super keen on since it came out. So yeah, love to see that. Unfortunately, our worst deck for the year is the so-called no bad cards Najeela. Maybe this means that I need to get some better reps on this deck. We're gonna have to continue to look at that as the year goes on in 2024, see what our results look like, see if maybe changing some cards in the deck will make it perform a little bit better. Our top 5 cards of the year for 2023. My one and only, Ad Nauseam, coming in very strong. #1 pick with 4 mentions across all of our decks. And this probably isn't surprising because it is one of the cards that we have in almost all of these decks. We have got a 3-way tie for the next position with 3 mentions for Grand Abolisher, 3 mentions for Defense Grid, and 3 mentions for Mystic Remora. And unfortunately, this isn't going to be a top 5. It's going to be a top 6 because again, we have a 2-way tie for the next position with 2 mentions for the One Ring and 2 mentions for Smothering Tithe. So looking at this list, it's definitely the year of silence, no doubt. Silence effects have been very high in my book. I've been super high on them because they're such a great way to protect your win. It's such a great way to defend yourself against multiple counterspells. I've said it before and I'll say it again, that a Grand Abolisher is worth 4 to 5 counterspells out of your opponent's hands. So it's just such an incredibly good card. And more than that, it looks like 2023 is the year of mid-range. We're grinding out value with Smothering Tithe or Mystic Remora. We're sticking those Grand Abolishers and we are getting some big dubs. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that you had a fun time looking this over with me. This was a really fun part of my 2023 and something I'm very keen on keeping up in 2024. Just before we get out of here, again, if you want to support the show, like, comment, subscribe. It is super helpful for getting the channel in front of new eyes and new fans of the show. So if you like this show, make sure you spread it to your friends, let them know where to find some awesome cEDH content too. If you want to support the show directly, go hit up our Patreon, get access to our private Discord, go hit up our Bonfire store to get awesome merch, Dragon Shield affiliate links, TCG player affiliate links. All of that is right down below this live video in the description. And thank y'all one more time for joining us. We'll see you next time, everybody.